The shoreline has always been a threshold. It is the place where two worlds collide, where the solid certainty of Earth surrenders to the restless expanse of water. To stand at the edge of an ocean is to confront both infinity and fragility in a single gaze. The horizon stretches out endlessly, the waves roll in with rhythms older than any civilization, and yet the ground beneath your feet is temporary, a narrow strip caught between advance and retreat. For as long as there have been humans, this boundary has pulled us closer, whispering promises of food, trade, mystery, and beauty. And yet, hidden within those same whispers, there has always been a warning. Imagine, for a moment, a small community thousands of years ago. They live by the shore not because it is safe, but because it is abundant. The sea offers fish, the tide leaves behind crabs and shellfish, the estuary nurtures reeds and fertile mud for crops. The people build their shelters on slightly higher ground, but they can still hear the eternal voice of the waves, rising and falling, night and day. For them, the ocean is both neighbor and deity, a provider that never rests. They sing songs about its gifts and murmur prayers to keep its anger at bay. Children chase each other along the wet sand, hunters repair nets beside smoking fires, and elders watch the surf, always with an eye that mixes reverence with caution. What they do not know is that the ground beneath their world is moving. The continents themselves drift, groaning and shifting as unseen forces beneath the crust rearrange the shape of the planet. Fault lines cut through seabeds, mountains rise and collapse in slow motion, and the oceans ride over these shifting plates like a restless cloak. Sometimes, centuries pass without change. Other times, a single day reshapes a coast forever. For those early coastal dwellers, the sea might have seemed eternal. But in truth, it was waiting, patient and watchful, holding within it a power too vast for them to imagine. The edge of water has always been more than geography. It is a mirror of human longing. The shore is where explorers push out to see what lies beyond. It is where traders return with stories and treasures from distant lands. It is where lovers walk, leaving footprints that the tide erases within hours. For poets, the sea has always been a metaphor for time itself, endless, shifting, impossible to contain. And yet beneath the beauty of this metaphor lies a reality darker and more indifferent. The sea takes back as much as it gives. Civilizations rise on its shores, but they are always built on borrowed ground. The first great harbors of the world, Tyre, Alexandria, Carthage, all owed their splendor to the sea. But long before those stone cities, long before writing or bronze, there were villages made of reeds, mud, and wood. Archaeological traces of such settlements tell us that people chose the coast with enthusiasm, perhaps knowing the risk but willing to accept it. Fishhooks carved from bone, shells used as ornaments, canoes dug from single trees, all speak of a life intertwined with water. Yet what remains of many such communities today lies beneath waves and sediment, forgotten until storms or dredges reveal them once more. To walk along a modern shore and imagine those vanished worlds is to feel the scale of time. The sand you feel between your toes may once have been part of a drowned forest. The gentle slope into the surf may conceal the foundations of ancient homes. The ocean does not erase, it buries, conceals, and transforms. What was once a fire pit becomes a reef. What was once laughter and song becomes silence beneath the waves. And still, we return, generation after generation, as though compelled by some instinct that refuses to learn. There is a paradox at the heart of the shoreline. It feels permanent because the tide is always there, reliable in its rhythm, unchanged for a lifetime. But in reality, it is the most impermanent place of all. Storms carve new inlets overnight. Earthquakes raise or lower entire coastlines by meters. Glaciers melt and seas advance inland, covering valleys, forests, and fields. The shore is never fixed. It is a line written in water, shifting with every age. To those who came before us, this paradox was no less mysterious than it is today. They may not have had maps or satellites, but they had their senses, and those senses told them that the ocean was alive, breathing, watching, capable of fury. For storytellers, this paradox became legend. In Mesopotamia, the flood was a punishment and a cleansing. In Polynesia, the waves were gods themselves. Along the Mediterranean, sailors poured wine into the water to ask for safe passage. These were not superstitions born of ignorance, but strategies for survival. When you face a force too large to control, you honor it. You bow to it. You ask it to spare you. And even then, sometimes, it does not. The world at the edge of water is therefore a world of balance. It is the balance between dependence and fear, between abundance and disaster. A fisherman knows that the same tide that fills his nets can sweep away his hut. A child knows that the same waves that delight in play can pull her under in seconds. An elder knows that the stories of past floods are not just tales but warnings. Life by the shore has always been lived with one ear tilted toward the sound of the waves, never fully trusting that tomorrow's ocean will look like today's. In this beginning chapter of our story, the focus is not on one disaster, not yet. It is on the stage itself, the liminal space where land and water wrestle endlessly for control. To understand what it means when the ocean takes back the shore, we must first understand why we stood there in the first place. Humanity has always loved the threshold, the view across the horizon, the feel of salt air, the promise of abundance. We have always known, somewhere deep inside, that this love comes with a price. The ocean does not keep accounts. It waits, it observes, and when the time is right, it takes. As we journey deeper into this story, remember this: the shoreline is not a gift freely given. It is a negotiation, fragile and temporary. Every grain of sand, every estuary, every fishing village clinging to the tide's edge is living on borrowed ground. And one day, as countless generations before us have learned, the ocean always returns to collect what is owed. There are places on this planet where the sea hides its secrets in silence. If you could dive beneath the waves and walk along the ocean floor, you would find traces of lives once lived where no breath of air now reaches. Stone walls that once held roofs and laughter now lie encrusted with barnacles. Ancient tree trunks, blackened with age, stand in the dim green light of shallow waters, their roots tangled with seaweed. Whole landscapes, once alive with birdsong and human voices, now lie mute beneath the tide. These are the forgotten shores, the places where the ocean has claimed what once belonged to the land. To speak of forgotten shores is to speak of memory itself, both human and geological. Every coastline that has ever existed leaves behind traces, scars, and echoes. Some can be seen clearly: a row of weathered posts on a beach where a pier once stood, the faint shape of a road that now disappears beneath a lake, the ghostly outline of a village visible when tides or droughts pull back the water. Others are invisible, remembered only in myths and whispers, stories of floods that erased entire peoples, legends of cities swallowed whole, songs that hint at lands where ancestors once lived and thrived. Long before written history, the ocean was already redrawing the map of the world. During the last ice age, sea levels were far lower. What we now know as the English Channel was once a vast grassy plain dotted with rivers and herds of game. Archaeologists call it Doggerland, a place where communities hunted, gathered, and told stories around fires. Today, it lies beneath the cold waters of the North Sea. Fishermen sometimes pull up bones of mammoths, stone tools, or antlers from the seabed, fragments of a vanished homeland. For those people, the shoreline was not where it is now. Their horizons stretched farther, their lands were broader. But as the glaciers melted and the seas rose, their homes disappeared beneath waves. The ocean whispered them away, leaving behind only relics. Doggerland is not alone. In the waters off India's coast, divers have discovered stone structures that may be the remains of ancient cities, walls and foundations arranged in geometric lines, now resting beneath silt and coral. In Japan, off the coast of Yonaguni, terraces and steps carved into stone plunge into the sea, stirring debate about whether they are natural formations or the remnants of a prehistoric site. Along the coasts of the Americas, drowned forests occasionally reappear when storms strip away layers of sand, their twisted roots reaching into the air like the fingers of ghosts. Each discovery feels like a voice from the past, faint but insistent, reminding us that what we think of as permanent land has always been negotiable. For the people who lived in those drowned worlds, the loss was not abstract. It was not a scientific curiosity or a point of debate. It was their homes, their food, their graves, and their sacred places. When the shoreline shifted, they shifted with it, carrying stories of the sea's hunger wherever they went. These stories grew into legends. Tales of floods appear in cultures scattered across the globe, often eerily similar despite the vast distances between them. A people in South America might speak of a great wave that swallowed their ancestors. A community in the Pacific tells of gods who pulled the land beneath the sea. A desert tribe, far from any ocean, remembers through myth a flood so large that it reset the world. Such echoes suggest that memory is longer than history. What makes these whispers haunting is not just their existence but their fragility. The ocean is a master of erasure. Sand shifts, waves grind stone to powder, currents scatter bones. Entire worlds are dissolved into silence. And yet, every so often, the ocean relents and offers back a fragment, a piece of pottery dredged from a bay, a row of timbers revealed after a storm, a sunken wall glimpsed by divers. These fragments speak, not in full sentences but in hints and murmurs, just enough to remind us that the present is built upon forgotten layers. To walk along a modern coast and imagine these lost places is to feel both awe and unease. Beneath calm blue waters, how many forgotten villages lie hidden? Beneath the hum of tourist beaches, how many graves rest unseen? The ocean does not boast about what it has taken. It simply swallows, holds, and covers. Its silence is not absence but possession. In this sense, the forgotten shore is more than a place, it is an idea. It represents the parts of human experience that vanish beyond memory, the stories that slip away when their keepers are gone. Every drowned village is also a drowned narrative, a silence that can never be fully recovered. Archaeology can reconstruct fragments, science can measure changes, but the lived reality, the laughter, the fear, the daily rhythm of those who watched the water creep closer, is gone. All we are left with are whispers. And yet, those whispers are powerful. They shape our imagination, they remind us of humility, they teach us that permanence is an illusion. The ocean's vastness hides not just ecosystems but entire histories, whole chapters of humanity that we may never fully read. Every time a diver descends into a murky depth and brushes sediment off a stone tool, every time a fisherman pulls up the tusk of an extinct beast from the seafloor, we are reminded that the ocean is not empty space. It is a library, vast and unorganized, its shelves built of silt and tide, holding volumes that only chance can return to us. As we continue, keep in mind that the story of the ocean reclaiming the shore is not only about sudden catastrophe. It is also about slow disappearance, about silence creeping in where voices once sang. Forgotten shores are everywhere, sometimes just a few meters beyond the surf we wade into without thought. They remind us that land is temporary, that the edge of water is always moving, always rewriting the map of memory. To listen to the whispers of forgotten shores is to realize that we are not the first to live at the mercy of the sea, and we will not be the last. Long before science explained tides as the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun, long before charts and mathematics could predict the rise and fall of water, human beings stood at the edge of the ocean and saw only mystery. The sea came and went with a rhythm that no one could control, lifting boats into the air and then leaving them stranded, flooding fields and then pulling back to reveal dry land. To those first coastal communities, this movement was not a mechanical force. It was alive. It was willful. It was a god. For early humans, to watch the sea was to feel the presence of something vast and unpredictable. The waves were voices, the tide a breath, the storms a rage. They had no instruments to measure air pressure or seismic shifts, but they had their senses, and those senses told them that the ocean was powerful beyond comprehension. Its moods changed without warning. Its bounty could be generous, filling nets with fish, or cruel, swallowing boats without mercy. Faced with such a force, people did what humans have always done in the face of the unknown: they gave it stories, names, and faces. Across the ancient world, we find echoes of this reverence. In Mesopotamia, the world's earliest known civilizations told of a great flood sent by the gods to cleanse humanity. The story of Utnapishtim, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, speaks of waters that rose and destroyed everything, sparing only the few who prepared. This was not merely myth, it was memory, passed down through generations who had seen what the rivers and seas could do when they broke free of their boundaries. Far away in the Pacific, Polynesian navigators treated the ocean not only as a pathway but as a divine being itself. To them, the sea was not an obstacle but a living companion, one that could guide or kill depending on whether it was respected. Rituals of offering accompanied long voyages, prayers whispered into the spray as canoes set out into the blue void. The people of those islands understood that without reverence, without acknowledgement of the sea's spirit, no journey could succeed. In the Mediterranean, sailors poured libations of wine into the water before departing a harbor, hoping to appease Poseidon, the god who ruled the waves. Fishermen in small wooden boats might whisper the name of a saint or a spirit before casting nets, not as superstition but as survival. To honor the sea was to negotiate with it, to strike an invisible bargain with forces too great to oppose. Even the daily tide was wrapped in reverence. Imagine living in a small village where the ocean pulled away every morning, revealing a wide plain of wet sand and stranded creatures. To walk out across that glistening expanse must have felt like walking into the domain of the divine. And then, within hours, the water would surge back, covering everything again. It was not difficult to see this as the breath of a god, inhaling and exhaling, alive with intention. To disobey, to linger too long when the water returned, was to risk being swallowed. The myths that grew around the sea were more than decoration, they were tools of memory. By telling of gods who punished arrogance, by weaving stories of floods that erased villages, people encoded warnings into culture. A child raised on such stories would not need a scientific explanation to understand caution. The tale itself carried the lesson: do not take the ocean lightly, for it remembers every slight. Consider also the role of storms. To watch a tempest gather over the horizon, lightning striking the water, winds tearing waves into mountains, this was not mere weather. It was fury incarnate. Cultures across the globe personified such storms as battles among deities, as anger released from the deep. To early minds, this made sense: how else could such sudden violence exist? A god enraged could explain what science had not yet learned. And by giving the sea a voice, by framing it as a conscious power, people could speak to it, plead with it, attempt to negotiate survival. The tide as a god was not always a punisher. In many traditions, it was also a giver, a mother, a bringer of life. Coastal communities depended on the daily rhythm of water for food and fertility. The ocean's generosity was celebrated in festivals, dances, and songs. The Maori sang of Tangaroa, the great god of the sea, who provided fish and sustained the people. In West Africa, the Yoruba revered Yamaya, mother of waters, a nurturing figure who symbolized abundance. To live by the shore was to live in constant tension between gratitude and fear, between seeing the sea as mother and as executioner. What is striking is how similar these myths are, even when separated by vast distances. Whether in South America, Asia, Africa, or Europe, the ocean was always more than water. It was personality, it was memory, it was justice. The universality of this view suggests that it was not mere imagination. It was a response to lived experience. People across the world must have seen the sea rise without warning, storms drown fields, and waves take lives. In response, they told stories that gave meaning to what might otherwise seem meaningless. And so the tide was a god, because it had to be. To stand against the ocean without reverence was suicide. To honor it was survival. Every prayer, every offering, every myth was a way of saying, "We see you, we fear you, we need you." It was not foolishness but wisdom, born of generations who learned that to ignore the whispers of the waves was to court destruction. Today, we may no longer bow to Poseidon or whisper to Tangaroa before casting a net, but the feeling remains. To stand at the shore, to watch a storm roll in across the horizon, is to feel something ancient stir inside us. Even with all our science, part of us still feels the tide as a god. And perhaps that part is wiser than we admit. Long before stone cities rose on hills and valleys, before temples were carved into cliffs or palaces built of marble, humans sought out the edges of water. To live by the shore was to live at the meeting point of abundance and danger. Archaeologists tracing the earliest settlements often find their remains not deep in forests or deserts but near rivers, lakes, and seas. It was along these edges that humans discovered that survival could be not only possible but rich. Imagine the end of the Ice Age, when glaciers melted and coastlines were reshaped with every passing generation. Small bands of hunter-gatherers moved with the rhythm of seasons, following herds and foraging for roots and berries. Yet again and again, they were drawn to the shoreline. Here, at the place where land and sea touched, life offered itself in greater variety than almost anywhere else. A single tide might bring in fish, crabs, mussels, and seaweed. Birds flocked to the coast in countless numbers, their eggs and meat within reach. Estuaries gave fertile soil where early experiments with planting could succeed. Freshwater met saltwater, creating wetlands alive with reeds, eels, and wild grains. For people with no farms, no herds, and no storage, this abundance must have seemed like a miracle. To sit by the edge of a tidal flat and watch the sea retreat would have been to see a banquet laid bare. Clams revealed themselves in the sand, stranded fish flopped helplessly, crabs scuttled among rocks. To early humans, it was not just sustenance but opportunity. The shore taught them predictability. Unlike the uncertainty of the forest hunt or the vast chase of bison across plains, the sea always returned, the tide always shifted. It was a cycle, dependable even if mysterious. This rhythm may have been the first lesson in timekeeping, the earliest clock marked not by stars or shadows but by the heartbeat of the ocean. Settling by the shore also meant learning to build differently. Shelters were made of reeds, driftwood, and hides, quick to assemble and quick to abandon. Paths wound along dunes and cliffs, shaped by wind and tide. Communities learned to balance closeness with caution, setting dwellings just far enough from the highest reach of storms yet near enough to harvest the sea. Fire pits glowed against the backdrop of surf, and smoke mingled with salt air. Children grew up knowing the sea not as an occasional visitor but as a constant presence, woven into every part of life. With settlement came innovation. Nets of woven fibers, hooks carved from bone, canoes hollowed from tree trunks, these were technologies born from the shore. They represent more than tools, they represent trust in the water, confidence that the ocean could be entered, not only watched. For the first time, humans expanded their territory not by walking across land but by floating on the surface of the sea. The shoreline gave them wings, of a sort, wings made of wood and sinew, carrying them to islands, across bays, and eventually into the wide unknown. But the shore was never only generous. To live there was to court danger. Sudden storms could flatten huts and sweep away children. High tides could flood camps. Salt water could seep into freshwater sources, spoiling them. And beneath it all was the memory of disaster, stories whispered of floods that had erased whole villages, of waves that came without warning. To settle at the edge of the sea was to gamble, to accept its bounty while never forgetting its hunger. Over time, these communities grew more sophisticated. Coastal dwellers became traders, exchanging shells, dried fish, and salt for goods from inland. The shore became not only a home but a highway. Paths along the coast connected one settlement to another, and boats transformed the sea from a barrier into a bridge. Ideas traveled along with goods. Language, art, and belief spread from village to village with the sound of oars dipping into water. In this way, the shoreline became the first great network of human connection, long before paved roads or written contracts. Archaeological finds confirm this story. Shell beads from coastal regions have been discovered far inland, proof that what was gathered by the tide found its way into the hands of those who had never seen the ocean. Stone tools fashioned hundreds of miles away ended up buried in coastal sands. The sea was already, even in deep prehistory, a force that connected human lives across distance. Yet what strikes us most, when imagining those first shoreline settlements, is the intimacy. Life was lived in direct contact with the sea. There was no separation, no modern seawalls or harbors, no steel ships or flood barriers. The people's survival depended on reading the smallest signs, the change in bird calls before a storm, the smell of seaweed on the wind, the unusual stillness of water before a wave. Their wisdom was not written but lived, carried in muscle memory, in the teachings of elders, in stories told around fires. To forget such knowledge was to invite disaster. The shoreline shaped them, and in turn, they shaped the shoreline. Footpaths eroded dunes, fish traps altered tidal pools, fires cleared reeds. Even the simplest acts left marks. Humanity was already becoming a geological force, even if those first settlers never realized it. And yet the ocean was always stronger. A single storm could erase months of work. A sudden surge could sweep away everything built. That cycle, of creation and erasure, of settlement and loss, was already in motion thousands of years ago. To reflect on these first settlements is to recognize a truth that echoes into our own time: we are drawn to the edge of water, again and again, despite the risks. Something in us cannot resist the horizon, the meeting of two worlds, the promise of abundance mixed with the thrill of danger. From reed huts on tidal flats to skyscrapers rising above modern coasts, the impulse is the same. We build where we should fear to build, we settle where we know the water will one day return. The first shorelines of settlement were the beginning of a pattern humanity has never broken. The people who first chose the shore may not have thought of themselves as fragile. To them, it was simply life, rich and immediate. But from the distance of thousands of years, we can see the fragility clearly. They built on borrowed ground, shaped lives around tides they could not control, trusted in patterns that sometimes betrayed them. And yet, they endured, and in enduring, they taught us something eternal: the shore is not merely a place. It is a condition of being human. There are images so ancient, so deeply rooted in human memory, that they feel almost like dreams. Among them is the vision of firelight flickering against dark water, sparks lifting into the night as voices murmur and echo. The rivers of prehistory were not silent places. They were gathering grounds, arteries of life, sources of food, water, and travel. Yet more than that, they were stages for one of the greatest human inventions, the communal fire. To imagine the first fires by the riverbank is to glimpse the birth of something larger than survival, the beginnings of community, of culture, of meaning. Water and fire are opposites in nature, yet humans learned to bind them together. Rivers offered fish, reeds, drinkable water, clay for shaping vessels. Fire offered warmth, protection, light, and the magic of transformation. Raw meat turned to nourishment, damp wood turned to smoke, stories whispered into permanence. The pairing of fire and river was no accident. The riverbank was flat, clear of dense trees, safe from sudden predators. It gave a wide view of the horizon, while the water itself served as a defense against sparks spreading to forests. To light a fire there was practical, but soon it became more than practical. Picture the scene: dusk falling over a wide river, its surface painted in streaks of gold and shadow. Families gather driftwood, dried reeds, or animal dung to feed the flames. Someone strikes stones together until sparks leap, another bends low to nurse the fragile ember into breath. Then, suddenly, the first flame bursts into life. Faces appear out of the gloom, features glowing orange and red, eyes reflecting tiny stars of light. The river catches the fire's shimmer, multiplying it across its surface. What begins as a simple act of survival becomes an act of creation, the world reshaped in color and warmth. Around these fires, humans became more than hunters and gatherers. They became storytellers. It is not hard to imagine that language itself found its first true flowering here, beside water and flame. Words alone cannot survive in the open air of day, scattered by wind and drowned in noise. But at night, when silence deepened and firelight drew people close, words found a chamber in which to echo. Stories could be remembered, shared, passed on. The river carried fish, but the fire carried memory. What were those stories? Perhaps they were not like the elaborate myths recorded thousands of years later, but simpler, rawer. They might have been accounts of hunts gone wrong, lessons disguised as entertainment. A father describing the shape of tracks, a mother warning of poisonous roots. They might have been fragments of awe, tales of thunder and lightning, of the sun vanishing into darkness, of dreams that felt too real. Around the fire, even silence carried meaning. A hand pointing toward the stars, a gesture toward the flowing river, could speak as loudly as words. The fire turned the night into a classroom, and every listener was a student of survival. But the fires by the riverbank were not only schools. They were theaters, places of drama. Shadows danced on faces, voices rose and fell, and laughter rang out. Children watched wide-eyed as adults mimed the chase of an antelope or the sudden lunge of a crocodile. Song likely grew from these gatherings, born of rhythm, the crackle of flames, the beat of hands on hollow logs, the chorus of voices blending with the flow of water. Music, like fire, transformed the ordinary into something more. It bound the group together, made them feel less alone. The riverbank fire was also a crucible of intimacy. Away from the hunt and the work of day, people saw one another differently in the glow. Eyes softened, faces seemed closer, and bonds deepened. Love, friendship, alliances, all of these may have found their roots in the warmth of firelight. To sit together at night was to declare trust. A lone fire drew predators, after all. To share it meant safety, meant loyalty. Over countless nights, these bonds hardened into something we might call society. Of course, fire was also power. To control it was to claim status. The one who could make fire from stone, who could keep embers alive through storms, was invaluable. Entire groups may have revolved around such figures, early leaders, respected not for strength alone but for knowledge. Fire was not easy to carry. Coals smothered in ash had to be tended, guarded, never allowed to die. Rivers may have helped in this, providing clay in which embers could be sealed, keeping them alive during travel. To lose fire was to risk hunger and cold, to keep it was to hold the promise of life. As communities grew, so too did their fires. Small clusters of flames became larger, more permanent hearths. Rings of stone appeared, circles that kept the fire contained and gave it dignity. Ash built up year after year, leaving traces that archaeologists still uncover today. Each layer is a page in the book of human becoming. To uncover such a site, a darkened stain of charcoal on ancient earth, is to find proof that our ancestors once sat there, once dreamed there, once turned night into something human. But the fires by the riverbank were not always peaceful. Just as they united, they could divide. Rival groups saw smoke rising and approached with curiosity or hostility. A fire was both a beacon and a challenge. Here we are, it declared, we claim this place. Battles may have been fought for control of a riverbank, for the right to sit by fire and water. The ashes that remain are not only of meals and stories but of conflict, of lives cut short in the glow of flames. And yet, despite danger, the pattern repeated. Wherever humans settled, the same image emerges, rivers and fire, water and flame. Across continents, across languages, the story is the same. It suggests something deep in us, a recognition that life requires balance, coolness and warmth, flow and spark, nourishment and inspiration. To sit by fire beside water is to feel whole. If we listen carefully, we can still hear it. On modern campsites, on the banks of great rivers that still run, people gather and light fires. They tell stories, sing songs, share food. They may not know it, but they are repeating a ritual older than civilization itself. The rivers have changed course, the fires are smaller, but the essence remains. Humanity has always been drawn to the meeting of river and flame, to that fragile light shining against the endless dark. The first fires by the riverbank were not just survival. They were the beginning of something larger, culture. The river carried bodies, the fire carried souls. Together they made humanity not just a species but a story that continues to burn. Memory is not carved in stone. It is fluid, shifting like the waters that once lapped against ancient shores. Human beings, long before writing, long before clay tablets or papyrus scrolls, carried their history in voices, in gestures, in the rhythm of stories told and retold by the fireside. To understand how memory functioned in these distant times is to peer into the tide of human consciousness itself, the ebb and flow of knowledge that sustained generations. Imagine a child sitting beside the riverbank fire, listening intently to an elder speak. The child does not write, cannot record the words, yet those words sink deep into the fabric of their mind. Repetition is the key. The same tale, told again and again, carves grooves in memory the way water shapes stone. Each retelling is slightly different, reshaped by the teller, but the essence remains. The memory becomes less about precise details and more about the wisdom, the lesson, the warning encoded within. In this way, memory was not a personal possession but a communal river, flowing through the group, carrying with it knowledge of edible roots, dangerous beasts, safe migration paths, the rhythms of the seasons. To forget was to risk death, to remember was to survive. But memory was more than survival. It was identity. The stories told around fire and water were not just about how to live, but why to live, who we were, and what it meant to belong to a group. The tide of memory did not move evenly. Some things were remembered with intensity, others slipped away. Trauma etched itself deeply. A flood that swept away a camp, a predator that struck in the night, these moments burned themselves into the collective imagination. They were retold for centuries, even millennia, until they became myths of angry rivers or spirits dwelling in the darkness. Memory magnified what mattered most: danger, awe, love, and loss. And so, long before writing, memory was already shaping culture. The great myths of later civilizations, the flood stories of Mesopotamia, the watery deluges of Mesoamerica, the ocean gods of Polynesia, did not emerge from nowhere. They are the echoes of ancient memories, told and retold so many times that they hardened into myth. The tide of memory, like the tide of the sea, always returns, reshaping what it touches. But memory is fragile. Without writing, it depends on the living. When an elder dies, so too may an entire branch of knowledge. Imagine a grandmother who knows the secret places where medicinal plants grow. If she is not asked, if her knowledge is not absorbed, the tide carries it away forever. The river forgets. Human beings learned early to fight against this loss. They invented rituals, songs, chants, and dances, not just for beauty, but as vessels of memory. Rhythm helped preserve knowledge, melody made it harder to forget, repetition locked it into the mind. The earliest songs may not have had words as we know them, but patterns of sound, rises and falls that echoed the rise and fall of the tide itself. In repeating those sounds, people repeated their knowledge. In this way, memory became art. And art, in turn, became a mirror of memory. Carvings on bone, ochre handprints on cave walls, the scratch of lines representing animals, all of these were attempts to anchor memory, to give it weight against the flood of forgetting. Yet even with these anchors, memory remained fluid. It adapted, changed, like a river changing course. A story told by one group might flow into another, altered slightly to match new landscapes, new dangers. Myths traveled as people traveled, carried not in bags but in minds. They spread across valleys and plains, seeding variations of the same tale wherever they landed. A lion in Africa might become a bear in Europe, might become a tiger in Asia, the essence of the predator remembered, even as the form shifted. This is why so many ancient cultures share strikingly similar motifs. The flood that destroys and renews. The serpent lurking in water. The hero who crosses the river between life and death. These are not coincidences, but tides of memory that began flowing tens of thousands of years ago by the fires on prehistoric riverbanks. Each time a story was told, it was like a stone dropped into water, ripples expanding outward, overlapping with other ripples, until an entire sea of shared human memory formed. But memory also contained longing. Not everything was practical or dire. Around the fire, people remembered the laughter of loved ones now gone, the sight of stars mirrored on the river's surface, the smell of rain on dry earth. These softer memories may have been even more important, for they connected people not just to survival but to meaning. To remember joy, to remember beauty, is to remember why life is worth living. The tide of memory nourished the spirit as much as the body. Philosophically, memory became a way of resisting time. Time moves only forward, but memory allows humans to move backward, to visit again the faces of the past, the moments of love and fear and wonder. It was, in a sense, the first form of time travel. When an elder described the hunt of their youth, the listeners were carried into that moment, living it again. The past was not gone, it was alive, flowing like a tide that could be summoned at will. Yet memory had another, darker aspect. Just as tides can overwhelm, so too can memory drown. To remember loss too vividly is to reopen wounds. To cling too tightly to the past is to be trapped by it. Perhaps this is why stories softened sharp details over generations. They blurred, grew symbolic, less raw, more mythic. In this transformation, pain could be borne. Tragedy became legend, grief became ritual, fear became lesson. The tide smoothed the jagged stones of memory, making them easier to hold. And so, in prehistoric nights, humans lived not only in the present moment but in layers of memory. They inhabited the world of now and the world of then, woven together. To sit by a riverbank fire was to sit at the meeting point of time's flow, the river carrying the present, the fire carrying the past, both joining in the tide of memory. Modern humans, with books and hard drives and digital clouds, often forget how fragile memory is. But the truth is, we still live in its tide. We repeat stories, we sing songs, we gather to remember. The technology has changed, the volume has grown, but the essence is the same. Memory is a river that never stops flowing, reshaping everything in its path. In those earliest days, when oceans had yet to reclaim the shores, when rivers were lifelines of survival, memory was humanity's greatest invention. Without it, there would have been no culture, no learning, no continuity. With it, there was the possibility of a future. Every ember carried forward, every song remembered, every gesture mimicked, all of it was memory against the silence of forgetting. The tide of memory still moves in us today. It is why we tell stories, why we build monuments, why we write and record and share. It is why, even now, we long to know the stories of those who came before, those who sat by the rivers and watched the sparks rise into the night. The tide has not ended, it has only grown wider, deeper, more powerful. And as we look back, trying to trace our beginnings, we find that the tide of memory carries us still, pulling us toward the shorelines of prehistory, where the first fires burned and the first stories flowed like water. The ocean is a patient storyteller. It waits, silent and vast, until the right moment comes, and then it speaks not with words but with waves. Across deep time, coastlines have never been fixed. They are shifting borders, drawn and redrawn by the pulse of ice and heat, by the breathing of the planet itself. To understand the day the ocean took back the shore, we must first understand that the ocean has always risen, always fallen, always claimed what humans thought was theirs. 12,000 years ago, as the last great ice age loosened its grip, the ocean began to stir. Vast glaciers, which for millennia had held the world in white silence, started to melt. Ice mountains taller than cathedrals, wider than kingdoms, cracked and thundered into the sea. What had been locked away as frozen memory returned to water, flowing downward, unstoppable. Rivers swelled, lakes overflowed, and the ocean began to rise. At first, perhaps, it seemed gradual, like the gentle lapping of tides. But in human time, the short span of generations, the change was terrifyingly fast. Villages that had stood safe on dry ground found themselves creeping closer to the edge. Fields that had fed families for centuries vanished under salt water. Forests drowned, their trunks becoming blackened stumps jutting out of shallow bays. The land shrank. The ocean advanced. The earth was reshaping itself before human eyes. Imagine a community living near what is now the North Sea. In that age, much of what is today sea was once a fertile plain known to archaeologists as Doggerland. It was a vast grassland rich with game, rivers full of fish, and soil soft for gathering plants. Families thrived there, raising children, telling stories, singing songs. But slowly, the sea crept in. At first, it may have seemed harmless, a flood here, a marshy patch there. But year by year, the land grew wetter, narrower, smaller. The people would have watched as the horizon shifted, as water claimed what had once been home. Eventually, Doggerland was gone, swallowed whole. All that remains now are fragments dredged from the seafloor, bones, tools, the ghosts of lives erased by rising waves. And Doggerland was not alone. Across the planet, coastlines redrew themselves. In Asia, what is now the South China Sea filled with water, covering plains that once connected islands. In the Americas, melting ice sheets released torrents that reshaped entire river systems. In the Middle East, the Black Sea Basin, once a vast freshwater lake, suddenly connected with the Mediterranean, flooding rapidly and violently, creating one of the greatest deluges in human memory. Each of these was a moment when the ocean rose, when what was once land became sea. For those who lived through it, the rising was not abstract. It was deeply personal. To lose land was to lose ancestors' graves, sacred sites, favorite hunting grounds. It was to watch familiar paths vanish beneath alien waters. The ocean was no longer distant, it was a predator at the doorstep, advancing slowly but relentlessly. Whole migrations were set in motion by its approach. People abandoned low-lying regions, carrying their stories inland. With them went the memory of what had been lost. These memories became myths. Flood legends are some of the most widespread in human culture. From Mesopotamia's tale of Utnapishtim to the biblical story of Noah, from Hindu traditions of Manu to the Maya accounts of deluge, the theme repeats: water comes, destroying and renewing, erasing and remaking. Such stories are not coincidences. They are echoes of real events, embroidered and reshaped over generations. They are how humans remembered the ocean rising. Picture a community on the shores of the Indian subcontinent, watching the Arabian Sea swell during monsoon after monsoon. Each year, the water pushes a little farther inland, salt creeping into soil that once grew millet and barley. The people are forced to retreat, carrying their gods, their rituals, their ways of life. And as they retreat, they tell stories, of divine anger, of celestial floods, of oceans that demanded tribute. In this way, the pain of loss was transformed into myth, into meaning. The ocean's rise was not always catastrophic in a single moment. More often, it was slow, almost imperceptible. But sometimes, it struck with fury. Ice-dammed lakes in North America burst, releasing floods of unimaginable scale. Torrents rushed toward the ocean, raising sea levels in violent surges. Coastal settlements could be wiped out in days, families forced to flee as the sea swallowed everything. For the survivors, such events would have been apocalyptic. They had no way of knowing the vast forces at play, only that the world they knew was ending. Yet not all was loss. The ocean gave even as it took. New coastlines meant new fishing grounds. Rising seas created estuaries rich with life, attracting birds, fish, and shellfish. For some, the encroaching ocean was not just a threat but an opportunity. People learned to adapt, to fish in deeper waters, to build boats that could ride the waves. The ocean was both destroyer and provider, a god with two faces. Still, the psychological impact cannot be overstated. To watch the land vanish is to feel powerless. Imagine standing where your grandparents once stood, only to see their world drowned beneath saltwater. Imagine knowing that the earth itself is shifting beneath your feet, indifferent to your needs, your desires, your memories. The ocean's rise was not just a natural event, it was an existential lesson. Humans learned, painfully, that nothing is permanent. That the shore you walk today may be gone tomorrow. That the ocean always waits. This truth seeped into culture. It shaped the way people thought about the divine, about fate, about the fragility of existence. In many traditions, water became a symbol of chaos, of the primordial force that precedes creation. It was both womb and grave, source and destroyer. To live beside it was to live with humility, to understand one's smallness before the vastness of time and tide. Archaeological evidence shows that entire cultural shifts coincided with rising seas. Tools changed, diets changed, rituals changed. People who once hunted deer on grassy plains became fishers and shell-gatherers along muddy coasts. Boats replaced spears, nets replaced bows. This adaptability is what allowed humanity to survive. But the memory of loss, the ache of what the ocean had taken, remained. It traveled in stories, in songs, in myths of floods and gods of water. We, too, are heirs of these memories. Even today, when scientists speak of rising seas caused by melting ice, the echoes are there. The same fear, the same uncertainty, the same helplessness. The difference is that now we can measure it, predict it, chart it on maps. But deep inside, the ancient resonance remains. The ocean rising is not just data, it is a wound in the human story, repeated across ages. When the ocean rose in prehistory, it was not a single day, a single event, but an era of endings and beginnings. It redrew the world. It scattered people, forced them into new lands, birthed new myths. It was, in many ways, the stage upon which civilization itself was born. For without the push of the ocean, without the floods that forced migrations, humans might not have spread, might not have adapted, might not have carried their stories inland to seed the great cultures of the future. The ocean is never truly gone. It only waits, patient, watching. Its rise in the past is a reminder, a whisper from prehistory, that what we build, what we claim, what we believe permanent, may one day belong to the waves. When the ocean rose, it taught humanity its first lesson in humility. And it is a lesson we are still learning. Stone does not speak in words, yet it remembers. Where wood rots and bone decays, where stories dissolve into air, stone endures. It carries the faint fingerprints of prehistory, the echoes of lives once lived on shifting shores. To walk among ancient stones is to enter into conversation with deep time, to hear voices not in sound but in presence. Every chipped flint, every carving, every upright monolith whispers of hands that once shaped it, of eyes that once gazed upon it, of communities that once called it sacred. Long before writing, stone was the first canvas of memory. In caves hidden from sunlight, humans pressed ochre onto rock walls, tracing the outlines of bison, mammoth, and fish. These were not mere decorations. They were echoes, attempts to hold on to what might otherwise be lost. When the ocean rose and swallowed the shores, the paintings on higher ground remained, reminders of a world that was changing. Each stroke was an act of defiance against forgetting, against the erasure of memory. By rivers and coastlines, people carved into rock faces. Spirals, lines, dots, and figures marked stone surfaces, their meanings now half lost to time. Some may have been maps of stars, guides to migration, or symbols of water and tide. Others may have been prayers, petitions to forces larger than themselves. To carve in stone was to make a claim, that something of this fleeting human life could endure beyond the body, beyond the campfire, beyond even the encroaching ocean. Stone tools tell their own story. Flint napped into blades, axes, scrapers, each fragment is an echo of human ingenuity. To hold one today is to place your hand where another hand once pressed, to feel the rhythm of strikes repeated until the edge was sharp. These tools speak of adaptation, of survival in a world that was shifting beneath the feet of those who wielded them. They also speak of artistry. Some tools were made more beautifully than necessity demanded, edges smoothed, forms balanced. In this, we hear not only the echo of survival but of pride, of beauty, of a mind reaching beyond the immediate. Perhaps most haunting are the standing stones, the great monoliths planted into earth by hands that sought permanence. Long before Stonehenge, long before the megalithic cultures of Europe, humans were raising stones. Some aligned with the sun, marking solstices and equinoxes, tying human life to cosmic rhythms. Others stood alone, silent sentinels watching over landscapes that have long since changed. Imagine such a stone on a shoreline now buried under the sea, toppled and submerged by the rising ocean. Its echo remains only in those that survived further inland, reminders of what once stood everywhere. Stone was also grave. Bodies were buried beneath cairns, covered with slabs, marked by upright markers. These stones held not just echoes of memory but echoes of grief, of love, of attempts to honor and preserve the dead. For communities watching the ocean swallow their land, burial stones may have been a way of holding on to the past, of saying, even if the land is gone, even if the water takes all else, this will remain. The echoes in stone are not always clear. Archaeologists uncover them like half-heard whispers, piecing together meanings that have blurred with time. A spiral carved into a cliff, is it a symbol of the sun, of water, of eternity? A cluster of dots, is it a constellation, a calendar, a simple game? The mystery itself is part of the echo. It reminds us that meaning was once here, that people once cared enough to carve, to paint, to build. Even if we cannot hear their exact words, we can still feel their presence. Stone also carried sound. In certain caves, where stalactites rang like bells, humans struck them, filling the dark with echoes. In open landscapes, upright stones created acoustics where voices amplified, where chants and songs grew louder, richer. Stone became both stage and instrument, magnifying human voices into something larger, something communal. To hear an echo in such a place is to hear not just your own voice but the voices of all who have come before. Even myths remember these echoes. Across cultures, stones are often said to speak, to hold spirits, to weep or bleed. Folktales tell of stones that were once people, petrified for their deeds, forever frozen in place. Such stories suggest that even in prehistory, humans felt the weight of stone as more than material. It was permanence in a world of change, an anchor against the tides, an echo of something eternal. When we find stone circles or carvings today, we often see them as ruins. But to those who made them, they were not ruins, they were living presences, filled with meaning. To place a stone upright was to say, we were here. This mattered. Remember us. Even if the ocean rose, even if the forests shifted, the stone would stand. And in its endurance, the echo would remain. There is a paradox in stone. It is hard, enduring, unchanging, yet it carries the voices of lives that were fragile, fleeting, gone. To walk among ancient stones is to feel the weight of both. The echo is faint, but it is there, waiting for us to listen. And so, even now, when we visit the remnants of prehistoric sites, when we hold flint tools in museums, when we trace carvings half erased by time, we are hearing the echoes in stone. They tell us that humanity has always sought permanence, always fought against the flood of forgetting. They remind us that even when oceans rise and lands vanish, something of us remains, etched into the bones of the earth itself. Stone does not speak in words, but it remembers. And if we listen closely, we can still hear the echoes. There is a silence that lingers over places once filled with laughter, with the rhythm of footsteps, with the smoke of cooking fires curling into the morning sky. Villages, once alive with community, now lie hidden beneath layers of silt, sand, or seawater. They are ghostly absences, their stories erased from the surface of the world but etched into the memories of the earth. When we speak of vanished villages, we are not only speaking of houses washed away or walls toppled by waves, we are speaking of entire worlds lost. Imagine standing on the edge of a shoreline thousands of years ago, where huts woven of reed and timber clustered together against the wind. Smoke rose from central hearths, and voices carried across the air, mothers calling to children, elders sharing stories by the fire, hunters mending their nets after a long day by the sea. Dogs barked, children played, the smell of fish and grain lingered. The village was not just a collection of shelters but a living, breathing organism of human lives woven tightly together. Now imagine the water creeping closer, not all at once but steadily, year by year, swallowing first the far fields, then the huts at the edge, until finally the entire community was forced to abandon the place where generations had lived and loved. Archaeologists uncover the bones of these vanished villages in fragments. A hearth buried beneath sand. Post holes marking where wooden beams once stood. Shards of pottery, cracked but still painted with patterns that tell of artistry and care. The outlines of storage pits, once filled with grain, now empty. Each piece is a whisper of a village that thrived and then disappeared. The ocean, relentless, does not preserve structures in the way deserts or caves might, but it leaves traces, faint echoes that remind us of what has been lost. One of the most haunting examples comes from Doggerland, the lost land beneath the North Sea. 10,000 years ago, this vast plain connected Britain to continental Europe. Rivers flowed through it, forests and meadows spread wide, and villages dotted the fertile earth. Here, people fished, hunted, and gathered, building lives that seemed as permanent as the land itself. But as the ice melted and the sea rose, Doggerland shrank, piece by piece, until all that remained were isolated marshes and finally nothing at all. Today, fishermen dredge up bones, tools, and even carved wood from the seabed, remnants of vanished villages swallowed by the waves. But Doggerland is only one story among many. Across the world, coastlines bear witness to the disappearance of villages. In the Mediterranean, entire Bronze Age settlements now rest below the waterline, their stone walls softened by centuries of tide. In the Pacific, islands once settled by Polynesian navigators have vanished entirely, remembered only in oral traditions passed down like fragile lanterns of memory. In the Americas, indigenous communities watched as rivers shifted and oceans reclaimed their homes, forcing them inland and reshaping their way of life. Each vanished village was not just a place but a web of human connection severed by forces far beyond human control. The tragedy of these vanishings is not only physical but emotional. For the people who lived there, to lose a village was to lose more than buildings. It was to lose ancestors buried in the soil, to lose sacred sites tied to myth and memory, to lose the comfort of knowing that the hearth where you were born would be the same one where you grew old. Imagine the heartbreak of leaving behind a burial ground where your parents lay, knowing you could never return. Imagine the sorrow of walking away from the fire circle where stories had been told for countless seasons, knowing the tide would wash it clean. The vanished village is not just an archaeological curiosity, it is the raw wound of displacement, of memory severed. And yet, villages do not vanish entirely. They live on in traces. Pottery shards speak of meals once shared. Charred seeds tell of what people ate. Post holes reveal the size and shape of homes. Even footprints, pressed into ancient mud and preserved beneath layers of sediment, speak of children running, of hunters walking home, of daily life caught in a moment of eternity. Each discovery is like brushing dust from a forgotten photograph, not the full picture, but enough to feel the presence of those who came before. Oral traditions also carry the echoes of vanished villages. Stories of great floods, of waters rising and swallowing the land, are found in cultures around the world. These are not merely myths but memories, passed down across generations, transformed into legend yet rooted in lived experience. For the people who told them, the vanished village was not forgotten, it became a warning, a lesson, a sacred reminder that nothing on the shore is ever truly permanent. The ocean itself remembers. Beneath its surface lie timbers of houses, tools scattered across the seabed, skeletons of boats that once carried people from one shore to another. Divers exploring these sites describe an eerie stillness. To swim among the remnants of a vanished village is to feel suspended between worlds, surrounded by silence yet aware of the lives that once filled the space with sound. The sea, in its quiet, becomes a keeper of memory, holding what humans can no longer see. Philosophically, the vanished village forces us to confront impermanence. We live our lives believing in stability, in the endurance of our communities, in the permanence of our homes. But history tells us otherwise. What is built can vanish. What feels eternal can be washed away. The vanished village is a mirror held up to our own time, a reminder that even our cities, vast and seemingly indestructible, may one day become ruins beneath rising seas. Just as ancient people once thought their villages would last forever, so too do we. And yet, the tide never stops. Still, there is resilience in these stories. Though villages vanished, humanity endured. People moved inland, built new homes, carried their traditions with them. The vanished village, though lost in one place, often lived on in another. Songs, tools, and rituals migrated with the people, reshaping themselves to new landscapes. In this way, the vanished village was not an end but a transformation, a painful rebirth into something new. The ocean may take the shore, but it cannot erase the human will to endure. Today, as we walk along coastlines, as we see waves lapping against stone foundations exposed at low tide, we are walking the border between presence and absence. The vanished village lies just beyond sight, but it is never entirely gone. It lingers in memory, in story, in fragments of stone and clay, in the restless murmur of the sea. To listen closely to the ocean is to hear not just the crash of waves but the muffled voices of those who once lived where the water now lies. The vanished villages are not only tales of loss but of continuity. They remind us that even as places disappear, the essence of human life, the drive to gather, to share, to build community, persists. They teach us that memory survives displacement, that even when the shore is gone, humanity carries the village within. The day the ocean took back the shore was also the day humanity learned to carry its home in its heart. When land sinks beneath the waves, memory does not always vanish with it. Sometimes it transforms, reshaped into story, carried across generations in the fragile vessel of myth. Where archaeology gives us shards and stones, mythology gives us voices, not always literal, not always factual, but profoundly true in another sense. Myths of the drowned world are among the oldest and most persistent stories humanity has ever told. They appear across continents, in cultures that never touched one another, separated by oceans themselves. The common thread is unmistakable: the waters rise, the land is lost, and humanity must reckon with forces beyond its control. The most famous of these is the story of the Great Flood. In the ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, waters engulf the world after gods decide to cleanse it, sparing only one man, Utnapishtim, who builds a vessel to survive. Millennia later, this story echoes in the Hebrew Bible as Noah's Ark, and in countless retellings across the Abrahamic traditions. But flood myths are not confined to one region. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a deluge sent by Zeus, casting stones behind them to repopulate the earth. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a fish of an oncoming flood and builds a boat to carry seeds and sages to safety. The parallels are striking: different peoples, different gods, yet the same vision of overwhelming waters and human survival. What is remarkable is how these stories mirror real geological events. As the last ice age ended, seas rose by hundreds of feet, swallowing vast coastal lands. Entire communities must have watched their homes disappear, forced to flee inland. These traumas left deep scars, not only in memory but in narrative. Myths of the drowned world may be the echoes of those real experiences, remembered not as history but as sacred lesson. The story became bigger than the event. It was no longer just about one flood but about the very fragility of existence, about humanity's smallness before the vastness of nature. Indigenous traditions also carry these echoes. Along the coasts of Australia, Aboriginal stories tell of ancestral lands that once stretched far into the sea, now drowned beneath the waves. Some of these oral histories, passed down for thousands of years, align uncannily with scientific reconstructions of rising seas. In the Pacific Islands, legends tell of entire homelands swallowed by the ocean, their people setting sail to find new islands. These are not just symbolic tales but living memories of displacement, preserved in song, dance, and ritual. Even in Northern Europe, echoes remain. Folklore speaks of sunken cities beneath lakes and seas, places where church bells still ring faintly beneath the water, where lights are said to glow on quiet nights. In Wales, the legend of Cantor Gwaelod tells of a fertile kingdom lost when its seawalls failed, its people drowned by neglect and fate. In Brittany, France, the tale of the city of Ys describes a glittering civilization consumed by the sea, punished for its decadence. These stories, though wrapped in moral lessons and embellished details, likely trace back to ancient memories of coastal flooding. The power of flood myths lies not only in their memory of real events but in their symbolism. Water is life-giving, yet also destructive. It nourishes fields, fills rivers, sustains communities, but when it rises uncontrolled, it becomes death itself. To tell a story of a flood is to wrestle with that duality, to make sense of a force that is both essential and terrifying. Flood myths are humanity's way of giving shape to chaos, of finding meaning in devastation. They are also stories of renewal. Almost always, the flood does not end everything. Survivors remain. Seeds are saved, animals carried, lands reborn. In the destruction lies rebirth. The drowned world gives way to a new world. This is a pattern deeply rooted in human experience. Even when villages vanished, people rebuilt elsewhere. Even when the ocean claimed the shore, life went on. Myths encoded this resilience, turning tragedy into cycle, loss into possibility. There is also a profound humility in these stories. They remind us that humanity is never fully in control. For all our building, our planning, our certainty, nature has the final say. In telling flood myths, our ancestors admitted their vulnerability, acknowledged that they lived at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. And yet, by telling the story, they also claimed endurance. We may not control the waters, but we survive them. We remember. We carry the lesson forward. Philosophically, myths of the drowned world also reflect a universal human anxiety, the fear of forgetting. When a village vanishes, when land is lost, what remains? Myth becomes a vessel for memory, preserving what history might otherwise erase. It keeps alive the knowledge that once, there was a land, a people, a way of life swallowed by the sea. In this way, the myth itself becomes a kind of ark, carrying not animals or seeds but memory across the flood of time. Today, when we read or hear these myths, we often treat them as metaphor, as allegory. But for the people who first told them, they were as real as the tides. They were not just stories but lived truths, passed down as warnings and reminders. And even now, as we face our own rising seas, the myths feel newly relevant. The drowned world is not just a thing of the past, it is a looming possibility for our future. The flood myth is not done with us. There is something profoundly moving about the persistence of these stories. They span continents, languages, centuries, yet they return again and again to the same image: water rising, land vanishing, humanity enduring. It is as if, at some deep level, the memory of the drowned world belongs to all of us. Perhaps because, in truth, it does. Our ancestors lived through it. Their memories became myths. And those myths, in turn, became part of who we are. The ocean took back the shore, but humanity took the memory and turned it into story. And that story has outlasted stone, outlasted wood, outlasted even the very villages it remembers. To speak of myths of the drowned world is to acknowledge the human gift of transformation, the ability to turn loss into meaning, destruction into story, silence into song. The drowned world is not gone. It still lives in us, whispered in our oldest tales, carried in the rhythm of waves, waiting to be heard whenever we listen to the myths that have outlived the flood. The sea has never been just water. For prehistoric communities living along the shifting shorelines, it was a living presence, a provider, a destroyer, a boundary, a mystery. To stand at the edge of the ocean was to face both abundance and threat, both comfort and terror. No wonder, then, that rituals grew along the coasts like wildflowers, woven into daily life, seasonal cycles, and great upheavals. By the sea, humanity sought connection not only with nature but with the unknown. Rituals by the sea were acts of negotiation. The ocean gave fish, shellfish, and salt, but it could also take lives, flooding villages, capsizing boats, swallowing entire stretches of land. To live beside such power meant constantly seeking balance. Offerings were made at tide pools or cast into waves, shells arranged in patterns, bones of animals, carved figures, beads of stone. These were not idle gestures. They were contracts, acknowledgments of the sea's authority. Each offering said, "We know you, we respect you, please, remember us kindly." Archaeological finds along coasts reveal traces of these acts. In Scandinavia, deposits of tools and weapons have been found in wetlands and estuaries, deliberately placed rather than lost. In Japan, early Jaman sites hold shell middens where certain bones and ornaments seem arranged with ritual intent. Along the Mediterranean, shrines near harbors suggest spaces where sailors prayed before setting out and gave thanks upon return. These fragments hint at the countless ceremonies now lost, performed not in monumental temples but on sand, on cliffs, at the water's restless edge. Some rituals marked transitions, the change of seasons, the ebb and flow of tides, the migration of fish or birds. Communities gathered when the moon swelled full and the waters pulled strongest, dancing, singing, drumming in rhythm with the waves. Firelight would flicker against the dark sea, the sound of drums mingling with surf, voices carrying into the night air. The sea was not passive in these moments. It answered with tide and roar, with spray and salt. For those who stood in that liminal space between land and water, it was a dialogue with something greater than themselves. Other rituals were tied to death. For those who lived beside the sea, drowning was always near. Bodies sometimes washed ashore, and in some cultures, the ocean itself was seen as a vast grave. To honor the dead, communities held rites at the shoreline, placing offerings in the surf, singing songs of farewell, sending firelit rafts drifting outward until flames vanished against the horizon. These rituals carried grief outward, letting the sea hold it. For the living, they were not only acts of mourning but of acceptance, a way of weaving human loss into the endless cycle of tide and return. The sea also inspired initiation rituals. To step into adulthood often meant facing the waters. Young people might swim across inlets, dive for shells, or stand against the surf as tests of courage. Success was not only physical survival but spiritual alignment, proving that one could meet the sea's gaze and not falter. Such rites were both terrifying and transformative. They bound individuals to their community and to the waters that defined its life. Myth and ritual often intertwined here. In many traditions, the sea was home to deities or spirits. To honor them, people offered songs, dances, carved images, or even animals cast into the surf. These were not abstract gods but immediate presences, felt in the salt air, heard in the waves. To perform ritual by the sea was to stand in their presence. It was both supplication and celebration, a way of acknowledging that human life was but one rhythm among many. Rituals were also acts of memory. In times when the ocean swallowed land, when villages were abandoned, communities returned to the shore to perform ceremonies that remembered what was lost. Songs told of places now beneath the waves. Offerings marked boundaries no longer visible. Fires lit on the shore became beacons of remembrance. These rituals transformed grief into continuity, keeping the vanished alive in the hearts of the living. Even today, remnants of these practices endure. In parts of the Pacific, offerings are still made to the sea before voyages. Coastal festivals across cultures still honor tides and fish migrations. The persistence of these rituals suggests that the human relationship with the ocean has never been merely practical. It has always been spiritual, emotional, symbolic. We do not simply live beside the sea, we live with it, through it, because of it. Philosophically, rituals by the sea remind us that humans have always sought to frame chaos in meaning. The ocean cannot be controlled, yet ritual gave a sense of order. To cast a shell into the surf, to light a fire against the tide, was to say, we are not powerless. We are part of this rhythm. We belong here. In that belonging lay resilience. Even when the sea took the shore, the people remained, bound together by ritual as much as by survival. The sea is both mirror and mystery. It reflects our fears, our hopes, our fragility. Rituals by the sea are humanity's way of answering the call of the waves, of weaving human life into the larger fabric of tides and time. And though the specific ceremonies may fade, the impulse remains. Even now, when we stand by the ocean, we feel compelled to pause, to reflect, to let the waves speak. In that pause is the faint echo of those ancient rituals, voices singing in rhythm with the surf, offerings cast to the deep, fires burning against the salt wind. The rituals are gone, yet they remain. The sea remembers, and so do we. Every departure is a story. To leave a place, to turn away from a home and step into uncertainty, is never simply a matter of walking. It is an act of grief and hope braided together. For prehistoric communities living on the edge of rising seas, departures were not occasional but recurring, written into the rhythm of survival. Villages were abandoned, shorelines receded, boats were launched toward unknown horizons. And with each departure came song. Songs were memory made sound. Where stone preserved carvings and pottery held symbols, song carried living emotion. Words, tones, and rhythms turned sorrow into something shareable, grief into something survivable. To sing was to acknowledge loss, to honor it, and at the same time to carry it forward. In the leaving, song became a thread binding past to future, anchoring memory even as feet walked away. Imagine the scene, a shoreline at dusk, villagers gathered for the last time in a place where generations had lived. Fires glow against the darkening sky, their smoke curling above the restless sea. Children cling to their mothers, elders sit with faces lined by the knowledge of endings. And then, voices rise. Low at first, like the hum of tide, then stronger, weaving together in harmony. The song tells of ancestors buried here, of harvests and hunts, of festivals once shared. It names the rivers and trees, the fish and birds, as if singing them into memory before they are lost. The words tremble with sorrow but also with resolve. Though we go, we will not forget. Anthropologists and ethnomusicologists studying surviving oral traditions note how song often carries the weight of departure. In Polynesia, chants recount voyages across vast oceans, keeping alive the memory of homelands left behind. Among Arctic peoples, songs preserve the rhythm of journeys across ice and sea. In African traditions, songs of migration recall rivers crossed and villages abandoned. These echoes suggest that in prehistory too, song was the vessel in which departure was endured. Without song, leaving would have been unbearable. With it, loss became a kind of continuity. The sea itself became part of the music. Waves striking rocks set a rhythm. Wind over reeds gave a drone. Even the calls of seabirds wove into the soundscape. Songs of departure were not performed against the sea but with it, as though the ocean itself joined in mourning and in memory. Perhaps it was this intertwining of human voice and natural sound that made the songs feel enduring, not just the cries of people, but the cry of the world itself. Songs of departure were also prayers. To sing while leaving was to appeal to forces larger than oneself, to ask the sea for mercy, to call on ancestors for protection, to remind gods or spirits that the people remained faithful even in exile. A melody could be both farewell and petition, farewell to land, petition for safe passage. In this way, song became a kind of offering, cast not into the water but into the air, carried outward like smoke. Some songs may have been practical. Rhythm steadies movement, unites voices, calms fear. To launch boats into rough seas, rowers might sing to keep time, to draw strength. To march inland away from the shore, carrying what little could be saved, song gave cohesion. Voices rising together dissolved isolation, the grief of one became the grief of all, and therefore bearable. In this sense, songs of departure were survival tools, as essential as fire or stone blade. But beyond survival, song preserved identity. For communities who lost not only homes but landscapes, song became the archive. Through lyrics and refrains, people remembered the shape of the coast, the sound of certain birds, the taste of fish that no longer swam where they now lived. In song, lost worlds remained alive. To sing was to keep vanished land present, to resist the erasure of memory by the encroaching sea. The song carried what the body could not. One can imagine children learning these songs, even after relocation. Around new hearths inland, elders would teach verses about the old shore, about the village now underwater. To the children, the words might sound like myth, but to the singers they were truth. Thus, songs of departure transformed into songs of remembrance, ensuring that the lost places lived on, if only in sound. There is a haunting beauty in this resilience. The ocean may take back the shore, but it cannot silence the voice. As long as someone sings, the place endures. Even today, fragments of such traditions survive. In coastal Ireland, laments speak of lands eroded by sea. In the Pacific, chants tell of islands no longer visible. These echoes remind us that humanity has always met departure not with silence but with music. Philosophically, songs of departure embody the paradox of impermanence. They are fleeting, vibrations of air that vanish the moment they are sung. Yet they preserve what is most enduring: memory, identity, meaning. In their ephemerality lies their power. They reflect the truth of human life itself, temporary yet capable of echoing across generations. Each song is like a footprint in sand, erased by tide yet carried forward in the steps of others. Consider also the silence that follows. When the last note fades, when the village lies empty, the ocean rushes in. And yet, in the minds of those who departed, the song continues. It becomes an inner rhythm, guiding steps, soothing grief, reminding them that though they leave, they remain connected. The sea takes the land, but the people take the song. In that exchange, survival becomes more than physical, it becomes spiritual. There is a line, though unspoken, that threads through all songs of departure: we are more than what we lose. The land may vanish, the hearth may crumble, the graves may drown, but the voice remains. It carries the essence of home across water, across generations, across centuries. Even now, when we imagine those ancient voices raised against the roar of waves, we feel their presence. Their songs did not die, they live in us, in the very human impulse to sing when we say goodbye. To leave is to wound. To sing is to heal. Prehistoric communities knew this truth instinctively. And so, whenever the ocean took back the shore, voices rose. They rose in lament and in hope, in farewell and in promise. They rose to remind the sea, and themselves, that nothing is ever truly lost as long as it can still be sung. The songs of departure are gone now, their melodies dissolved into silence, their words forgotten. But if you stand on a shoreline at dusk, if you listen closely between the crash of waves, you may hear them faintly. Not in language you understand, but in rhythm, in tone, in the rise and fall of sound carried by wind and water. They are there still, woven into the sea's eternal song. And perhaps that is the greatest truth: the sea took the villages, the fields, the hearths. But humanity, in turn, gave the sea its music. The ocean became not just the taker of land but the keeper of song. And so, even in departure, there was a kind of return, the voice of humanity mingling forever with the voice of the sea. Long before the sea swallowed their homes, long before entire villages were forced to scatter inland, humans discovered a power that no flood could ever fully extinguish: fire. Fire was more than a tool, more than warmth, more than a way to cook food or drive away beasts. For communities staring into the dark unknown of the ocean, fire was defiance. It was the one element they could command, a flame that answered to their hands and their will. Against the endless, consuming tide, the flicker of fire was a statement: we will not be erased. Picture the scene, the tide creeping higher each season, creeping closer to huts and hearths. Families could not hold back the water, but they could gather wood, strike stone against stone, and bring forth flame. In the evenings, when waves hissed against the shore, villagers lit great fires. The flames licked upward, casting golden light across faces lined with worry. Children stared at the sparks rising into the black sky, as though the fire itself might carry prayers to the ancestors. The sea roared, but the fire crackled louder, demanding to be seen. It was a spectacle of resilience, a reminder to themselves that even as the waters claimed the land, they still held mastery over this one bright force. In practical terms, fire was survival. It dried soaked clothing, warded off chill winds, hardened wooden tools, smoked fish to preserve it for leaner days. In storms, when rain poured down in torrents, protecting fire became an act of near desperation. Families shielded embers inside pottery jars, buried them in ash, carried them from one shelter to another. To let the fire die was to invite despair. To keep it alive was to proclaim that survival continued, that no matter how high the tide reached, human hands still held flame against the dark. But fire was not merely functional. It was symbolic, almost sacred. Across countless cultures, myths speak of fire as a gift from gods or trickster heroes, a spark stolen from the heavens. For people staring down the endless hunger of the sea, fire became a living spirit, one they could nurture, protect, and feed. Where the ocean reminded them of what they could not control, the hearth reminded them of what they could. A single flame held in a clay bowl was a promise: here, in this small circle of light, we remain human. It is easy to imagine ceremonies in which entire communities gathered at night around towering bonfires, flames rising as if to challenge the very horizon. The sea pressed closer with every moon, but still the fires blazed. The rituals may have been solemn, voices raised in chant, or joyous, children leaping across sparks in play. In every case, fire declared continuity. The land might vanish, but the flame could be carried. It belonged not to the shore but to the people themselves. Even departure was marked with fire. Before leaving a village for the last time, elders may have set flames to old huts, letting smoke rise into the sky as a signal to the ancestors. To abandon a place without fire would have felt like leaving a body without soul. Fire made farewell complete. It burned memory into the air, turning sorrow into smoke that drifted far beyond the shore. And as boats pushed away into open water, torches burned in the prows, casting light on dark waves, a fragile but powerful statement of resistance. There is poetry in the way fire and water mirror each other. Both are hungry, both consume, both reshape landscapes. But where water takes, fire transforms. The flood erased homes without trace, but fire turned wood to ash, ash to soil, flame to memory. By wielding fire, humans reminded themselves that they were not helpless against the elements. They too could wield a power of transformation. They too could create light where there was none. Consider the psychological weight of this act. In times when everything seemed to dissolve into water, the act of striking flint and watching a spark leap into flame was affirmation. A tiny crackle, a flicker of light, and suddenly despair gave way to determination. Children who had wept at the loss of fields and hearths could be soothed by the familiar glow of embers. Elders who mourned drowned graves could still feel dignity in tending the fire. In this way, flame became therapy, binding communities together when everything else fell apart. Even today, we see echoes of this prehistoric defiance. Campfires still gather families together in a circle of safety. Candles are lit in memory of the lost. Torches burn in protest marches. Fire has never been only about utility, it has always been about meaning, about declaring presence in a world that threatens to erase us. In prehistory, standing before the rising tide, lighting fire was both ancient ritual and future inheritance. Ultimately, fire was humanity's answer to the sea. The water came without asking, cold, endless, indifferent. But humans struck back with sparks. They raised flames against waves, refusing silence, refusing surrender. Though the water always won in the end, the fire had already done its work. It had sustained the body, lifted the spirit, preserved the memory. Fire did not stop the flood, but it kept humanity from drowning in despair. And so, the image remains, a shoreline at night, waves surging, villages trembling. Yet in the darkness, fire burns. Its light dances across faces determined not to vanish. The tide rises, but the flames rise too, as if to say, you may take the land, but you will never take the fire. When the sea came, it did not only claim land and homes, it claimed the very rhythm of childhood. The children born during those years of rising waters became known, in whispered memory, as the children of the flood. They were the ones who had no memory of the wide open fields their parents spoke of, no recollection of villages stretching far into fertile plains. For them, life had always been a narrowing shoreline, a creeping tide, and the sound of water that never left the air. Imagine a child standing barefoot on wet sand, toes sinking slightly into the earth, listening to the eternal hiss of waves. To the older generations, that sound was a warning, a reminder of what had been lost. But to the children, it was the soundtrack of existence. The ocean was not invader, it was environment. They grew up with it as constant companion, a force that shaped their games, their fears, their songs. Where their parents longed for dry earth, they built little boats out of reeds and driftwood, racing them along tide pools. They splashed in brackish water, laughed when waves knocked them down, and in their innocence found joy in the very element that their elders dreaded. Yet innocence never lasted long. Children of the flood learned quickly that the sea was unpredictable. One moment playful, the next cruel. Stories abound of little ones pulled too far while waiting, of mothers running into waves with desperate screams, of families gathering around fires to mourn another loss to the tide. From a young age, they were taught rules: never turn your back to the sea, never wander to the water's edge alone, never trust the stillness of calm waves. Their lullabies often carried warnings hidden in gentle melodies, songs that wrapped danger in soft notes so that even toddlers absorbed the lesson: the sea can love you and kill you in the same breath. Still, there was resilience. These children became masters of adaptation. They learned to swim almost before they could walk. They climbed quickly, instinctively seeking higher ground. Their games mimicked survival, racing up dunes before waves could catch them, diving under when playmates pretended to be storms. What their parents taught through fear, the children transformed into skill. They were not just survivors of the flood, they were shaped by it, molded into beings attuned to a world in flux. Their role within families also changed. In settled times, children were often seen as extensions of lineage, future inheritors of land and tradition. But the children of the flood inherited uncertainty. They became symbols of adaptation itself, proof that even as the world shifted beneath their feet, life went on. When parents despaired, it was often the laughter of children chasing each other along shrinking beaches that reminded them why they must continue. To see a child growing, learning, thriving despite disaster was to witness defiance against extinction. The myths of these children reflected their liminal existence. Some tales described them as born with salt in their veins, able to speak to the waves, half claimed by the ocean from birth. Others told of children destined to wander far inland, carrying with them stories of the flood so that memory would not die. Whether myth or metaphor, the idea was the same: these children embodied both the tragedy and the survival of their people. They were the hinge between worlds, the last generation of shore dwellers, and the first to imagine futures elsewhere. But the psychological weight of such childhoods cannot be ignored. To grow up hearing parents whisper about vanished villages, to witness tears over lost graves and drowned hearths, instilled a deep sense of impermanence. For many, this became a lifelong shadow, a knowledge that nothing lasts forever, that stability is an illusion. And yet, from that shadow emerged a certain wisdom. They were raised in constant reminder that survival depends on movement, that one must never cling too tightly to place, but instead carry identity within. The ocean also influenced how they saw time. While earlier generations marked seasons by harvests and growth, the children of the flood measured time by tides and storms. They watched the moon and learned how it pulled the water closer or let it recede. They grew up in rhythm with celestial cycles, more attuned to the sky and sea than to the soil. In this way, they became both vulnerable and enlightened, vulnerable because they never knew permanence, enlightened because they understood patterns that their ancestors had overlooked. And perhaps most profoundly, these children carried memory forward. Even as their people abandoned the coasts and moved inland, even as they left behind flooded homelands, the children carried the sea within their minds. As adults, they told their own children of days spent watching waves eat the land, of nights when storms howled like spirits, of fires lit as guardians against the tide. They preserved the story not just as tragedy, but as inheritance, a reminder of what humanity endures. Without them, much of that knowledge might have washed away with the last shoreline. We might imagine one of these children, now grown old, sitting far from the sea in a dry inland settlement. Perhaps he runs his hand through a bowl of water, staring at ripples as though watching an entire childhood reflected there. Perhaps she tells stories to wide-eyed grandchildren about a world where the sea rose every year, where houses fell into waves, where survival was a lesson learned before play. These children became storytellers, carriers of memory. In their voices, the ocean never stopped rising. The children of the flood remind us that history is not only written in stones or bones, but in the lives of the young. They reveal how disaster reshapes identity, how survival is passed down not only through genes but through memory, skill, and song. They are the proof that even in times of collapse, life insists on joy, insists on adaptation, insists on moving forward. The tide took much, but it could not take the laughter of children running barefoot on wet sand. That laughter carried humanity across the flood. There are migrations that thunder in the memory of history, armies on the march, caravans stretching across deserts, ships with sails fattened by the wind. But the migrations that followed the rising seas were quieter. They were not conquests, not ventures of glory, but hushed departures. Families slipped away under dawn light, carrying baskets, tools, and memories. Villages that once rang with laughter and song grew silent. No farewell drums, no banners, no triumphant procession. Only the soft crunch of feet on wet sand, moving away from the life they had known. These were the silent migrations, and they shaped humanity as much as any war or empire ever would. The silence came not only from choice but from necessity. The rising sea allowed no negotiation, no time to prepare elaborate departures. Entire hamlets disappeared overnight when storms surged. People left as they were, sometimes abandoning possessions too heavy to carry, sometimes leaving the graves of their ancestors unvisited one last time. There was grief in the silence, yes, but also fear, a superstition that to speak too loudly of the departure was to invite the sea to follow. They slipped inland quietly, as though trying not to wake the sleeping giant that had already consumed so much. Picture a mother leading her children along a forest path, her husband following with a bundle of tools over his shoulder. Their eyes dart back toward the shore, where smoke from the last fire still curls upward. They do not speak. Words feel heavy, dangerous. The children are told to keep walking, not to cry out, not to call for what has been left behind. Silence itself becomes a ritual, the sound of migration. For days, their voices are little more than whispers, as though carrying the hush of the drowned village with them. These migrations were not single, unified movements. They happened in waves, scattered across generations. One family would leave in desperation after a storm, another months later when crops failed from saltwater poisoning. Slowly, over years, the coastlines emptied. Entire cultural landscapes dissolved into memory. And yet, because these were not dramatic, sudden displacements but quiet trickles, the migrations went largely unrecorded in any enduring form. They survive only in faint echoes, myths of vanished villages, songs of land swallowed by waves, whispered tales of ancestors who walked inland when the sea rose. The silence also carried a deeper psychological function. To migrate loudly is to celebrate or to mourn. To migrate silently is to endure. Silence turned the act into something almost sacred, a burden shared in stillness. It was in silence that people learned to listen to the land around them, the rustle of forests, the call of birds, the trickle of rivers that might offer new homes. By leaving quietly, they attuned themselves to the environment that would decide their fate. But silence did not mean absence of feeling. On the contrary, it amplified emotion. Without words to cover it, grief became heavier. Without songs to distract, the pain of leaving was sharper. Yet within that same silence grew resilience. Those who walked in hush carried within them a discipline, a resolve not to falter. Their migration was not celebrated, but it was endured, and endurance left its imprint on the generations that followed. As these groups spread inland, they reshaped human geography. Once, rivers had been secondary, sources of water for fields, channels for fish. Now they became lifelines, pathways into new interiors. Families followed river valleys into untouched lands, building temporary camps along banks, moving as the waters allowed. Forests that had once been hunting grounds became homes. The migrations expanded humanity's map not through ambition but through necessity. And yet, from necessity, came innovation. New foods were discovered, new landscapes adapted to, new relationships formed with peoples further inland. We can imagine the transformation of culture. Languages carried by migrating groups blended with those of settled inland communities. Rituals once tied to the ocean shifted toward rivers, hills, or plains. Gods of the shore were not forgotten, but their voices grew quieter as new spirits of land and sky took prominence. The children of migrants grew up with stories of seas they had never seen, and slowly, the ocean became myth more than memory. Within a few generations, the once familiar coasts had turned into haunted landscapes of legend. And yet, the silence endured even in memory. These were not migrations that people boasted about. There were no sagas of triumph, no heroic epics. Instead, the migrations entered cultural memory as whispers, as fragments. A lullaby that warns of water rising in the night. A proverb that speaks of leaving before it is too late. A ritual of walking in silence before planting the first seeds in new ground. The silence became tradition, handed down as both trauma and wisdom. Archaeology today sometimes uncovers traces of these quiet movements, inland sites where once coastal tools appear suddenly, or pottery styles that suggest sudden blending of cultures. The evidence is there, but like the migrations themselves, it is understated. Shards of clay, scatterings of shells far from shore, ghostly hints of journeys made in hush. The silence of prehistory echoes even in the silence of the ground. Why does this matter? Because the silent migrations remind us that history is not only built from noise. Empires rise with trumpets, cities fall with screams, revolutions announce themselves with gunfire. But the migrations of survival, the movements that allowed humanity to endure climate, disaster, and change, often happen in near silence. They are not less significant for their quiet, if anything, they are more profound. They speak of endurance without spectacle, of determination without applause. In our modern world, where migration is still one of humanity's defining struggles, the story of the silent migrations offers perspective. It tells us that long before borders and nations, people were already moving, quietly, out of necessity. It tells us that silence does not mean absence, and that resilience is often practiced not in grand declarations but in footsteps taken one after another in the dim light of dawn. So let us remember them, the families who left without fanfare, who carried their children into forests, who built new homes without songs to mark the moment. Their silence was not emptiness. It was the sound of survival. It was the hush of footsteps that carried humanity away from the drowning coast and into the unknown future. The tide swallowed their villages, but the silence of their migrations carried their story forward, all the way to us. The sea may have erased villages, swallowed fields, and scattered families, but it could not wash away everything. Long after the tides receded from memory, long after the children of the flood had become elders telling stories far inland, the ocean's history remained inscribed in the earth itself, in stone and in bone. Where human voices fell silent, the land carried whispers. Where myths blurred into song, the ground preserved what the water could not. And today, it is in those echoes, fragile, fragmented, and haunting, that we still glimpse the lives of those who faced the rising tide. Stone was always the more faithful witness. Long before the waters came, people had chipped stone into blades, axes, and scrapers. They had shaped points for spears, ground stones into pestles, carved grooves for hafting handles. When the sea swept away their homes, the stones endured. Buried beneath layers of silt, sealed in the sediments of drowned coastlines, they waited. Thousands of years later, archaeologists find them along ancient shores or deep underwater, tools still sharp enough to cut. Each flake struck from a core carries the rhythm of human hands long gone. In these edges and scars, we hear the echo of survival. But stone was not only practical, it was symbolic. Imagine a people watching the tide swallow their world, yet still taking time to shape stone beads or carve marks on pebbles. These small objects, often dismissed as trinkets, were memory made material. A necklace of shell and stone might remind a mother of the shore where she once gathered food. A carved pebble might hold the story of a hunt now impossible on flooded land. To leave with such objects was to carry fragments of the shore inland, to keep the ocean close even as it became dangerous to approach. Bone, too, holds stories. The bones of animals reveal diets disrupted by saltwater intrusion, fish replacing crops, shellfish supplementing shrinking harvests. Burned bones show feasts or desperate last meals. The bones of humans themselves bear marks of migration, stress, and adaptation. Some skeletons show injuries from waves or debris, others the long wear of carrying burdens across new landscapes. Teeth record chemical signatures of changing water sources, telling us how families shifted from rivers to wells, from fresh streams to brackish pools. In every fracture and trace element, the flood whispers its presence. Even burial sites reveal echoes of the sea's advance. Graves once dug in dry soil were later found submerged, skeletons lying in silt, their orientation disrupted by waves. Some were carefully reburied further inland, bones carried like precious cargo, ancestors refusing to be abandoned to the ocean. Others were left where the tide reached them, becoming part of the drowned landscape, ancestors claimed by water. For the living, such choices must have been agonizing. But for us, they provide records. To find a skeleton deep below today's shoreline is to hear, across millennia, the voice of a people forced to retreat. There is also evidence not written in bones or stones themselves but in their absence. Along ancient coasts, entire regions lack the tools and structures one would expect from thriving villages. This absence speaks loudly: people once lived here, then they were gone. What remains is not the fullness of their lives but the void carved by the flood. Silence itself becomes an echo, a reminder of how much was lost. Still, the fragments that remain are profound. A hearth, preserved beneath layers of sand, tells of nights when families gathered against the tide. A scatter of fish bones reveals adaptation to changing diets. A stone axe, found miles inland, suggests migration with tools carried from the coast. These objects may seem small, but they are pieces of a vast puzzle. Each one pushes back against forgetting. Each one proves that even if the ocean erased villages, it could not erase humanity. And there is something deeply poetic about this endurance. Stone and bone are the most fragile of storytellers. They do not sing, they do not weep, they do not shout. They lie buried, mute, waiting. Yet when uncovered, they speak with clarity that no myth alone could provide. They tell us that these floods were not only stories, not only metaphors, but lived realities, tragedies and triumphs etched into the very fabric of the earth. Consider the perspective of those who left these traces behind. Did they ever imagine that, thousands of years later, strangers would study their discarded tools, their broken bones, their ornaments of shell and stone? Did they know that by shaping an axe or carving a bead, they were writing messages across time? Perhaps not consciously. And yet, in a sense, they must have known. To make something lasting in the face of disaster is to resist erasure. To work stone, to care for bone, is to declare that life mattered, that even if the sea swallowed the village, memory would remain. The echoes also remind us of continuity. The people of the flood were not so different from us. They cut, they carved, they buried their dead with care, they adorned themselves with ornaments, they sought to leave something enduring. Their world was undone by water, but their choices ensured that traces survived. In stone and bone, we meet them not as strangers but as kin, linked across thousands of years by the desire to be remembered. Ultimately, the echoes in stone and bone are both haunting and hopeful. They haunt us because they show how much has been lost, how many lives, how many villages, how many stories were swallowed by the tide. They humble us, reminding us that nothing we build is beyond the reach of time and nature. And yet they also give hope, because they prove that even in loss, something endures. A chipped blade, a carved bead, a skeleton buried with care, these are testaments that humans did not simply vanish. They adapted, they moved, they remembered. When we touch these echoes, we are not just studying artifacts. We are listening. Listening to voices that spoke not in words but in actions, not in song but in survival. Listening to a chorus carried forward by the earth itself, whispers of the flood preserved in silence until we were ready to hear them. And perhaps, in that listening, we find the truest lesson, that nothing is ever fully erased. Even when oceans rise and villages fall, the essence of humanity, our will to endure, our need to leave traces, lingers in the most fragile of forms. Stone and bone may crumble, but their echoes carry forever. Long before archaeology sifted the sands, long before science charted the rise of seas, people carried the memory of floods in stories. Where bones decayed and stones lay buried, myths kept breathing. They did not preserve dates or precise coastlines, but they preserved something more enduring: emotion. The terror of the rising tide, the awe before forces beyond human control, the grief of loss, the miracle of survival, all of these were carved into myths, passed from mouth to mouth, from firelight to firelight, from generation to generation. For those who lived through the floods, the sea was not simply water. It was a being. It was hunger, anger, judgment, sometimes even mercy. In countless traditions across the world, the ocean becomes a god or spirit who decides the fate of humankind. The flood is not an accident, it is a choice. And to tell the story of that flood is to try to explain the unexplainable, to give reason to catastrophe. One of the oldest and most famous examples lies in Mesopotamia, where tales of a great deluge echo in both the Epic of Gilgamesh and the later biblical flood of Noah. The Mesopotamian version speaks of gods growing weary of humanity's noise, deciding to drown the world. A chosen survivor, Utnapishtim, builds a vast boat, gathers animals, and rides out the waters until land reappears. In this myth, we hear the voice of people who lived beside rivers that often flooded, who saw entire towns submerged when waters rose too far. Their story crystallized survival into legend, the boat as hope, the flood as divine judgment, the rainbow or bird as promise of renewal. Yet Mesopotamia is not alone. Across the globe, cultures tell similar stories. In India, the ancient text of the Satapatha Brahmana describes Manu, the first man, who was warned by a fish of a coming flood. He built a boat and tied it to the fish, who guided him safely across the waters. In Greece, the tale of Deucalion and Pyrrha tells of a flood sent by Zeus to cleanse the earth. In China, legends speak of Yu the Great, who tamed floodwaters and founded civilization. In the Americas, stories of floods ripple through indigenous traditions, some describing a great deluge sent to wash away corruption, others telling of survivors clinging to canoes, mountaintops, or floating logs. What unites these stories is not their detail, but their resonance. Each one reflects a people who knew what it meant to face water as both life-giver and destroyer. Each one remembers, in symbolic form, what archaeology shows us in stone and bone, that floods were not isolated accidents, but events woven into the very fabric of early human experience. Of course, myths are not newspapers. They are not bound by dates or strict geography. They are memory transformed into metaphor. A flood myth may combine many smaller floods, or stretch one family's escape into a universal salvation. But to dismiss them as mere stories is to miss their power. Myths allowed people to process trauma, to weave meaning from loss. They explained to children why their ancestors no longer lived by the sea, why certain lands were forbidden, why the gods demanded respect. They also offered reassurance: if humanity had survived before, perhaps it would survive again. In this way, flood myths acted almost like ancestral warning signs. They preserved the knowledge that waters could rise, that whole worlds could vanish. A child listening to the story of Noah, or Manu, or Deucalion, learned not only about gods and boats but about the fragility of human settlement. These myths were survival tools in themselves, not in wood or stone, but in memory. And yet, they were more than warnings. They were art. Around fires, people shaped them with rhythm and imagery. They carved them into chants, poems, rituals. They painted them on cave walls, carved them on stones, performed them in ceremonies. The flood was retold not just to inform, but to move. To remind people of humility before nature, of the duty to respect balance, of the promise that even after catastrophe, renewal is possible. But myths, like tides, shift with time. As floods passed further into memory, the stories evolved. They gained new layers, moral lessons, divine justice, prophecies of cycles. In some versions, the flood is punishment for human arrogance. In others, it is a cleansing to prepare the world for rebirth. Over centuries, floods that once drowned fields became symbols of renewal, of wiping the slate clean, of life's ability to begin again. Even today, these myths live with us. They echo in scripture, in folklore, in art and cinema. They remind us that water still commands awe, that catastrophe still shapes culture. When modern scientists speak of rising seas due to climate change, we can almost hear the ancient chorus of myths stirring again, warning us that humanity has faced this before, and that the stories of survival are still being written. The most striking realization, perhaps, is this: myths carved by waves outlasted villages, temples, and even languages. Civilizations crumbled, but the flood lived on in story. And that tells us something profound about the human spirit. Even when all else is lost, the houses, the harvests, the very ground beneath our feet, memory endures if it can be shaped into story. In listening to these myths today, we are not only hearing tales of gods and boats. We are hearing the pulse of human resilience, the will to carry forward meaning even when the world drowns. They are proof that memory is not only carved in stone and bone, but also in words, in imagination, in myth itself. And so the floods that carved the world also carved the stories. Waves may erase villages, but myths carve mountains. Myths anchor memory deeper than any tide can reach. They are, in a way, humanity's boat, carrying us across the endless waters of time. Civilizations rise, endure, and fall, not always with fire and conquest, but sometimes with silence. The most devastating force is often not what destroys, but what is no longer remembered. This is what some historians and philosophers call the great forgetting, the slow erasure of the deep past, when the memory of floods, extinctions, and upheavals faded from living cultures. And with forgetting, came vulnerability. In the earliest generations, people remembered vividly. They told their children about the flood that took the village, the mountain that collapsed, the shore that drowned. They carved marks into wood and stone, they painted signs on walls. But human lives are short, and memories fracture easily. After a few generations, the stories softened. Details blurred. The flood that had once been a specific event became legend. By the 10th generation, it was myth. By the 50th, it was dismissed as fantasy. Yet the waters never stopped rising and falling. The earth did not forget, even if humans did. One of the strangest ironies of human history is how societies often rebuild on the very same coasts that once destroyed them. Ruined harbors were repopulated. Floodplains that drowned were cultivated again. Villages lost to the sea were replaced by new ones, just a little further inland. Over time, the lesson that "this place is dangerous" slipped into silence, and silence became ignorance. The land looked safe, fertile, inviting, until the ocean returned. The great forgetting was not accidental. It was born of necessity. For people to go on living, they had to suppress their terror. No community could thrive while forever expecting another flood. And so they shifted the balance. They remembered enough to tell stories, but not so much that the fear paralyzed them. The memory of destruction was softened, filtered, reshaped. Slowly, the practical warnings were swallowed by symbolic language. But forgetting has consequences. When warnings become myths, and myths become fairy tales, the wisdom encoded in them loses force. Future generations no longer see them as instructions for survival, but as entertainment, morality tales, or quaint traditions. A story that once meant, "Do not build too close to the shore, for the sea will rise again," becomes, long ago, "the gods punished mankind." And the danger, real and ever-present, hides in plain sight. Archaeology offers haunting examples of this. On the coasts of the Mediterranean, layers of drowned settlements lie beneath harbors where later cities were built. In the British Isles, forests once grew where waves now crash, their blackened stumps still visible at low tide. Entire villages were erased, yet new ones sprang up above them. The past was buried not just by sediment, but by silence. Why do humans forget so quickly? part of it is the rhythm of time. Oral tradition can stretch far, but it bends under the weight of centuries. Without written records, without stone inscriptions, memory depends on voices, and voices fade. But part of it is also willful. Forgetting is a survival mechanism of its own. To carry the constant memory of catastrophe is unbearable. So cultures bury it beneath ritual and myth, and eventually beneath nothing at all. This forgetting reshaped not just memory of floods, but of entire modes of life. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, deeply attuned to landscapes, rivers, and seasons. Then agriculture rose. Villages became towns, towns became cities. In this new rhythm, the past before farming became almost unthinkable, an era written off as savage, primitive, without knowledge. Whole libraries of wisdom about landscapes, seas, and survival were cast aside as irrelevant. The long memory of the earth was abandoned for the short memory of the plow. And yet, the ocean remained patient. It has always been patient. Humanity's forgetting did not erase its power. The tides returned in cycles, centuries of calm punctuated by sudden surges, sometimes creeping, sometimes violent. Civilizations unprepared were caught off guard again and again. Ancient Alexandria fought to keep its shores intact. Medieval England watched towns slip into the sea. Even in the modern age, cities like Jakarta and New Orleans struggle against the same reality: the ocean does not forget. The great forgetting, then, is not only about the past. It is also about the present. We live in an age of unprecedented knowledge, satellites scanning the globe, science tracking the rise of seas with precision. And yet, forgetting persists. Many modern societies treat climate change as abstract, distant, myth-like, much as ancient people treated the memory of their floods. We read about drowned cities of the past and feel only curiosity, not warning. We forget that what happened before can, and will, happen again. But perhaps forgetting is never total. Perhaps, even in silence, fragments endure. A fisherman avoiding a certain bay. A family telling an old tale of the sea that came inland. A ritual honoring a flood god long after belief in gods has faded. Memory hides in cracks and corners, waiting to resurface. Archaeologists dig it up. Storytellers revive it. Scientists translate it into data. What was forgotten returns, though often too late to prevent the same mistakes. The great forgetting is a reminder of a paradox at the heart of humanity: we survive by remembering, but we also survive by forgetting. Memory warns us, but forgetting frees us to build again. The danger is imbalance. Too much forgetting, and we rebuild blindly in harm's way. Too much memory, and we may never dare to build at all. The ocean, indifferent, continues its cycle. The only question is whether we will carry forward the wisdom carved into stories and ruins, or whether we will allow it to dissolve again into myth. When we look at drowned ruins beneath the waves, we are not only looking at what the sea took. We are looking at what humans chose to forget, and at the price of that forgetting. Each drowned stone is a whisper from the past, asking us whether we will remember differently this time. There is a pattern in history, a rhythm that humankind struggles to hear. At first it comes as a whisper, a tide rising a little higher each season, storms growing fiercer, coastlines eroding grain by grain. Then it comes as a surge, sudden and undeniable. The tide always returns. And when it does, it reminds us of everything we once forgot. In the ancient world, people who had rebuilt along the coast slowly began to notice the same pattern their ancestors once knew. Shorelines shifted. Harbors silted. Villages endured decades of calm only to be swallowed one stormy night. It was as though the sea were reminding them that nothing built upon the shore was permanent. In northern Europe, stories tell of towns lost beneath the waves of the North Sea. The legendary city of Dunwich, once a thriving medieval port, now lies mostly beneath the water, its churches crumbled, its graves consumed. In the Netherlands, floods known as the St. Elizabeth's Flood or the All Saints' Flood erased entire landscapes, killing tens of thousands and reshaping coasts forever. Each flood seemed like a singular disaster at the time, but together they formed a chorus, the return of the tide. Further south, in the Mediterranean, ancient ports like Ephesus, Heracleion, and Canopus sank into the sea, their ruins discovered only in modern times by divers. The tide does not always return in violence, sometimes it is patient, eroding stone by stone, pulling entire cities beneath. To the people living in those harbors, the process might have seemed invisible. One generation watched the water creep closer, the next saw their temples half submerged, and the third knew only ruins below the waves. By then, the tide had reclaimed what once seemed eternal. But the return of the tide was not always tragedy. For some, it was renewal. Floodplains left behind fertile soils. River deltas enriched by sediments birthed civilizations. The same waters that drowned villages nourished crops in the centuries that followed. To live with the tide was to accept its double face, destruction and renewal, loss and abundance. Still, humans were never content to simply endure. They built walls, dikes, levees, canals, structures to hold the tide at bay. The Dutch reclaimed land from the sea with astonishing determination, constructing defenses so vast they were visible from the heavens. The Venetians raised their city on islands and pilings, living in harmony with tides that both threatened and sustained them. The return of the tide became not only a natural rhythm but a challenge to human ingenuity. Could we outlast it? Could we control it? The answer, again and again, was temporary. No wall stands forever. No canal remains unbroken. The tide bides its time, patient as stone. When the defenses fail, as they always do eventually, the return of the tide feels even more catastrophic, not only nature's blow but the collapse of human pride. The great irony is that we have always known this. Even the ancients spoke of it. Greek philosophers warned that nothing built by man was immune to time and nature. Poets wrote of the sea's eternal hunger. And yet, knowing does not stop us. We continue to build on the edge of the ocean, drawn as if by instinct. The tide recedes, leaving behind flat, fertile land, and we rush to claim it, forgetting the price it once demanded. The cycle repeats, each generation believing they will be the exception. But the return of the tide is not merely physical. It is also psychological, cultural, spiritual. When waters rise, so too does memory. Myths long buried stir again. Old tales of floods suddenly feel urgent, not distant. The story of Noah or Manu or Deucalion transforms from quaint legend to living metaphor. In those moments, the human psyche reconnects with its deep memory, the ancient fear of drowning, the ancestral awe of water. The tide rises not only on coasts but within us. Today, we face another return of the tide, though on a scale unlike any in recorded history. Seas are rising once more, not from God's anger or chance alone, but from our own hand. Melting ice, warming oceans, shifting climates, together they awaken the ocean. The creeping floods of the present mirror those of the past. Cities from Miami to Jakarta, from Venice to Dhaka, already feel the water rising beneath their foundations. Like the drowned towns of antiquity, they stand on borrowed time. And still, the response follows the old pattern. We build walls. We raise houses on stilts. We pump water from streets and rebuild after storms. Each effort is brave, ingenious, and temporary. Each buys time but not immunity. The tide is patient, and it always returns. There is a temptation, when facing this reality, to despair. To see only destruction, inevitability, loss. But the history of the tide also holds another lesson, survival. Again and again, humans endured. They adapted, migrated, reshaped their lives. When the tide erased one shore, people built a new inland. When floods destroyed harvests, communities found new ways to grow. The return of the tide does not mean the end of humanity, it means transformation. Perhaps this is the deeper truth of the cycle: the tide returns not only to destroy but to remind us that permanence is an illusion. It strips away our arrogance, our certainty, our monuments. It humbles us, forcing us to adapt, to imagine, to change. And in that change lies both grief and possibility. Standing at the shore today, watching waves creep closer, we are connected across millennia to the first humans who watched their villages drown. Their fear is our fear. Their resilience is our inheritance. The tide is not our enemy, though it feels like one. It is our teacher, relentless, impartial, eternal. The return of the tide is not just history. It is prophecy. It has come before. It is coming again. And it asks us the same question it asked our ancestors: will you remember this time? Will you adapt before the waves rise? Or will you wait, rebuild, forget, and let the tide write the story again in ruins beneath the sea? In the end, the tide always returns. But how we respond, how we carry its memory, how we shape our lives to its rhythm, that is the choice left to us. When we stand before the ocean, we do not only face water and horizon, we face time itself. Every wave is a reminder of cycles older than humanity, older even than mountains. The tide has taken and returned, drowned and revealed, forgotten and remembered. But in this moment, as seas rise once more, we are asked not only to look backward but forward. What lessons will we carry into tomorrow? The first and most urgent lesson is humility. For too long, human history has been told as a story of triumph, of mastering fire, conquering land, taming rivers, raising cities. Yet the ocean has always been a quiet counterpoint to that narrative. It whispers, "You have never conquered me, you have only borrowed time." The drowned harbors of Egypt, the sunken ruins of the Mediterranean, the lost villages of the North Sea, all of them remind us that even the mightiest civilizations can vanish in the face of water. To accept this truth is not defeat, but wisdom. Humility opens the door to adaptation. The second lesson is memory. Our ancestors did not fail because they faced floods, they failed because they forgot. Their stories warned them, their myths echoed with truth, but over generations those warnings were dulled. Today we have the benefit of science, data, maps, and satellites, yet we are at risk of repeating the same cycle of forgetting. Rising seas are treated as abstract numbers, distant possibilities, instead of lived realities already reshaping communities. If we are to learn anything, it must be this: memory must be preserved not only in books and servers but in culture, in daily choices, in collective identity. To survive tomorrow, we must remember yesterday. The third lesson is resilience. Floods did not end humanity, they transformed it. Every time the ocean advanced, people adapted. They moved inland, shifted crops, reimagined homes. This does not mean the losses were small, they were enormous, measured in grief, hunger, and exile. But survival endured. In that endurance lies hope. To face rising seas today is not to face extinction, but transformation. It will demand migrations, new technologies, new ways of living. It will require courage, flexibility, and above all, imagination. The fourth lesson is balance. Ancient flood myths often framed the deluge as punishment for imbalance, arrogance, greed, violence, or neglect. Whether one believes in divine judgment or not, the symbolism remains powerful. Today's rising seas are driven not by gods but by human imbalance with the earth, burning fuels too quickly, cutting forests too recklessly, consuming too greedily. The flood, once mythic, is now scientific, but the moral lesson remains the same: if we live without balance, the waters will rise. The path forward must be one of harmony, of living not as conquerors of the earth but as participants in its rhythms. The fifth lesson is perspective. To us, the loss of a coastline feels catastrophic, the drowning of a city unthinkable. But to the ocean, to the earth, these are minor adjustments in a vast symphony of change. Continents shift, mountains rise and crumble, seas advance and retreat. The earth has survived far greater upheavals than humanity. What is at stake is not the survival of the planet, but our place upon it. This perspective can be sobering, even frightening, but it can also be liberating. It reminds us that we are not the center of the story, but part of it. To live with this awareness is to live more gently, more wisely. The sixth lesson is storytelling itself. Every drowned ruin, every ancient myth, every rediscovered harbor teaches us that stories are the vessels of survival. They carry memory across centuries when stones crumble and villages sink. What we choose to tell, and how we choose to tell it, shapes the resilience of those who come after us. If we frame the ocean only as an enemy, we pass on fear. If we frame it as a teacher, we pass on wisdom. If we frame survival as impossible, we pass on despair. But if we frame survival as transformation, adaptation, and renewal, we pass on courage. Tomorrow will be built not only on policies and technologies but on the stories we choose to carry forward. And finally, the seventh lesson is continuity. The tide is not an event, it is a cycle. There will never be a final victory, never a last flood. The ocean will always rise and fall, always reshape the shore. Our task is not to end the cycle but to live within it. This requires patience, long-term vision, and humility across generations. It asks us to build not only for ourselves but for those who will face the tide long after we are gone. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means reimagining our relationship with the coast, building flexible, movable, adaptive cities rather than rigid monuments. It means honoring wetlands and mangroves as defenses stronger than concrete. It means respecting the memory of drowned places, not building blindly over them again. It means treating climate change not only as a scientific problem but as a cultural and spiritual one. And above all, it means remembering that the ocean is not our adversary but our mirror. Its movements reflect our choices, our balance, our memory, our humility.